I'm Daniela Ellerbeck, the Manager of the Constitutional Programs at the FW de Klerk Foundation, and joining me today is Shaun Kinnes, one of the Foundation's interns who helped compile the Human Rights Report Card of 2023. Shaun, welcome.
Thank you.
So in the course of your research, what stood out for you was the fact that crime statistics, macro and microeconomic events, that all impact on the right to dignity.
Yes.
Can you talk to us a bit about this, looking at, for example, the right to housing and water that you touched on in the report card, and what can be done to make sure that South Africans actually live a dignified life?
Sure. So just basically one of the first things one could touch on is that the state should be proactive as opposed to reactive, in the sense that we live in an exceptionally disruptive era and disruption needs planning. One of the things that the police should be doing in tackling crime is working alongside your provincial and local CPFs, where you bring communities together with policing and you encourage dialogue amongst the two. And let's not also forget that your research community plays a large part of this. So just sometime last year in November 2023, Mitchell's Plain Policing Precinct partnered up with the Institute for Security Studies, where they took the neighborhood of Tafelsig as a case study and looked at what time of the day do crimes occur and how can we match that with our policing operations. Pretty standard aspects in operations, but something so simple, decrease crime by 20%, which means that there is even larger room for police, think tanks and communities to come together to eventually...
It's basically just effective use of police resources because you started talking to the community.
100%, bringing the community, your think tanks together and your policing structures together.
That's fantastic. And when it comes to things such as the right to housing and water that you touched on, I mean, these are fundamentals. Like if you don't have access to food, if you don't have access to water, if you don't have access to housing, those impact your right to dignity.
100%. Obviously, we live in very difficult economic times as well. So people who were previously in your middle classes may now be in your working classes, and those previously in the working class may find themselves unemployed, meaning that those macro and micro factors that impact upon their income mean ultimately they cannot afford rent. Do I move back with my parents, or do I wind up on the street? Hence, what is the state doing about it? Instead, the state chooses to put exceptional budget cuts on housing, so more especially social housing, targeted at those earning between 2,000 and 20,000 a month. Excessive budget cuts were placed upon that income group, leading to a proliferation of homelessness, as well as a cut in grants to cities that are actually responsible for building these housing programs.
Okay, and I mean, you touched there on the macro and micro factors that would have resulted in people shifting down in terms of economic classes where they had found themselves in, and that would have resulted in unemployment. I'm immediately thinking of the fact that we're still recovering from the COVID-19 lockdown. What are some of the other macro factors?
Obviously, one of the other macro factors is that at a time now, companies, the cost of doing business is exceptionally harsh, both because of the governmental problem of too much red tape being put on private sector businesses, meaning that they cannot generate jobs, but also, like you said, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and also other macro impacts such as the Russia-Ukraine war, downgrading profits of your private enterprises, meaning that less money available to the business to create jobs at the end of the day.
South Africa being grey listed, load shedding, rising fuel prices, all of these things. No, I understand where you're coming from. One of the things you mentioned was food security.
Yes.
Perhaps you can talk to us about this.
I mean, food security, that's really part of our issue of polycrisis that we face today. So just touching on the macro and micro again, your macro and micro, basically your macro factors such as the Israel-Palestine conflict, as well as your Russia-Ukraine war, there's drastically increased the prices of your wheat products, your bread, as well as your cooking oil. I mean, these form part of the staple diets of your poor, working class and middle class, basically people from all walks of life. The only issue is your poor to your working class cannot maybe adapt as fast as cannot express as much resilience as fast as your higher income groups. But also your micro challenges, so load shedding, obviously that has direct consequences on the production and output of farming, which means that there's less food from the farm onto your table. And then we also have to look at the water crisis. If there's no water to irrigate your crops, obviously that's a downturn in crop yield. but then also
or safe water to irrigate your
Sure,
crops.
sure.
I mean, one of the things you touched on is the 2023 Blue Drop report, and you also touched on the Hammanskraal water crisis.
Yeah.
So if the water infrastructure is not producing safe water for you to irrigate your crops.
Sure. So obviously that can obviously lead to a downturn because crops also need a sustainable, healthy water source to be able to produce food for us, whether it's your maize, your wheat, or even your potatoes or your tomatoes. So that has
The quality
direct
of our rivers
impact
actually
upon,
directly impacts our food.
Especially on, I mean, many people may not be able to afford fresh tomatoes, but I mean, canned tomatoes, the price of that goes up drastically, affecting your working class and your poor, whether you are dependent on a SASSA grant or whether you just fall below the poverty line of 3,500 Rand.
Okay, so turning to what specific actions the government can prioritize to try and uphold the right to dignity, facing these microeconomic challenges, facing crime, like you've said, what are some of the actions they can undertake?
If one has to look at it, right, budget cuts have affected the police in a drastic way. The state now spends 1,500 Rand protecting each individual in this country, but they have allocated this year an increase in the VIP protection budget to your ministers and your premiers. That seems exceptionally harsh coming from an average citizen walking to the shop that feels unsafe. So the state, there is room for fiscal expansion, but like I said, there is room for partnerships between the state and communities and your think tanks that go about not only creating a safer community, but also a safer country.
Basically use the money that you do have well. Use
Yeah.
it well by talking to people that you're actually trying to help and saying, okay, how can we make this work so that we're more effective?
For sure.
Okay. Thank you so much, Shaun.
Thank you very much.